Some people leave when they're angry. Some people leave when they're tired. But the most damaging kind of leaving happens quietly, when someone convinces themselves they're being practical. Because years later, when life finally slows down enough to reflect, that silence comes back to speak. And when it does, it doesn't whisper. It doesn't explain. It reminds. Let me ask you something before we go any further. Have you ever made a decision that felt reasonable at the time, logical, even necessary, only to realize later that it cost you something you can never replace? Not money, not comfort, but something deeper: legacy, presence, time. This is one of those stories. It's about a man who divorced his wife while she was pregnant, not because he hated her, not because there was another woman waiting, but because he believed responsibility had limits. And it's about a woman who never chased him, never begged, never explained herself louder than she needed to. She carried her silence carefully, along with something else. Her name was Naomi Turner. She was 39 years old when her marriage ended, old enough to understand what she was losing, young enough to still be blamed for it. She lived in a modest two-bedroom home in a quiet Midwestern neighborhood, the kind of place where people wave politely but don't ask personal questions, where routines matter more than drama. At 5 months pregnant, Naomi didn't have the energy for drama anyway. The divorce didn't begin with shouting or accusations. It began with paperwork. A thin envelope slid across the kitchen table one Tuesday evening, stopping beside a bowl of soup Naomi hadn't finished. "I think this is for the best," her husband said. His name was Eric Turner. He said it calmly, the way someone announces a change in plans, the way people speak when they've already made peace with a decision and assume the other person will catch up. Naomi looked at the envelope, then at him. She didn't cry, didn't raise her voice. She asked one question: "Is this because I'm pregnant?" Eric exhaled slowly, like someone preparing to explain a complicated problem. "It's not that simple." That answer told her everything. Emotional neglect rarely starts with cruelty. It starts with distance. Eric had stopped going to doctor appointments months earlier, said waiting rooms made him uncomfortable, said he trusted Naomi to handle it. He stopped asking how she felt, stopped placing his hand on her stomach when the baby moved. When Naomi mentioned names, he changed the subject. When she talked about the future, he spoke about logistics. You know that feeling when you're talking, but the other person has already left the room? That. Naomi felt it long before the papers arrived. Eric didn't see himself as heartless. He saw himself as realistic. He was nearing 50. His career demanded flexibility. He had imagined a quieter chapter of life, less responsibility, not more. An unexpected pregnancy felt like chaos to him, like a door closing instead of opening. He didn't say that out loud. Instead, he used softer words. "I'm overwhelmed. I didn't plan for this. I don't know if I can do this anymore." Words that sound reasonable until you realize who they're spoken to. The divorce moved quickly. No arguments about furniture, no dramatic confrontations. Eric packed efficiently, left behind a coffee mug Naomi had bought him years earlier, chipped at the rim. At the door, he hesitated. "You'll be okay," he said. Naomi nodded, not because she believed it, but because she didn't want him staying out of obligation. The door closed, and with it, a version of her life she would never return to. Pregnancy changes the way time feels. Days feel heavier, nights longer. Naomi's body was doing something miraculous, while her life was quietly dismantling. She still went to work, still paid her bills, still smiled at neighbors who didn't know what to say. There is something about carrying a child alone that forces emotional discipline. You learn quickly where your energy can go and where it cannot. Naomi didn't spend hers on anger. She spent it on survival. Eric told people the divorce was mutual, that they had grown apart, that timing just wasn't right. When asked about the pregnancy, he framed it carefully. She wanted it more than I did. He didn't realize how much that sentence revealed. Naomi gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Lydia. Eric wasn't there. Not because Naomi barred him, but because he said hospitals made him uncomfortable. She didn't argue. Silence had become her language. Years passed. Naomi raised Lydia with structure, not bitterness, with consistency, not resentment. She worked steadily, budgeted carefully, built a life that didn't depend on anyone returning. Lydia grew up observant, the kind of child who listened more than she spoke. Naomi became the kind of woman people rely on without ever asking how she learned to carry so much alone. Eric moved on, changed apartments, changed jobs. Life didn't fall apart immediately. It rarely does. But something was missing. And years later, when a letter arrived that forced him to look backward, really look, he would realize that some decisions don't announce their consequences right away. They wait. And when they finally speak, they don't sound like anger. They sound like truth. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, mixed in with grocery coupons and a utility bill Eric hadn't opened yet. It was thicker than the rest, official-looking, with his name typed neatly across the front. He almost tossed it aside. Almost. Something about the return address made him pause. Not recognition, exactly, more like a faint tug of familiarity he couldn't place. He opened it standing up, one hand still gripping the envelope, the other holding the paper as his eyes scanned the first few lines. It wasn't from Naomi. It wasn't from a lawyer either. It was from a school, an elementary school. The letter was brief, polite, informational. It explained that a student had listed Eric Turner as an emergency contact, that there had been a minor incident, nothing serious, but protocol required notification. At the bottom was a name, Lydia Turner. Eric sat down slowly. He hadn't seen Lydia in years, not really. A few photos Naomi had mailed early on, a birthday card he sent once and never followed up on. Time had slipped by quietly, the way it does when there's no routine pulling you back. For a moment, his first reaction wasn't guilt. It was surprise. He hadn't expected to still be listed. Then something else settled in, a strange discomfort he couldn't explain. He read the letter again, more carefully this time. The wording was neutral, professional. But it did something he hadn't done in years. It placed Lydia in the present, not as an idea, not as a responsibility he once stepped away from, but as a person who existed now, in a classroom, with scraped knees and emergency contacts. He folded the letter and set it on the table. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to do next. Eric had always believed that distance softened things, that time naturally erased the sharp edges of difficult decisions. But sitting there, in a quiet apartment that didn't feel like home, he realized something unsettling. Time hadn't erased anything. It had preserved it. He tried to remember the last time he'd spoken to Naomi. Years ago. Brief, polite, efficient. She hadn't accused him, hadn't demanded anything. That calm had made it easier for him to stay away. Now, it felt heavier. He told himself he should call the school, confirm he'd received the letter, ask questions. Instead, he stared at his phone. Have you ever noticed how hard it is to make a call when you know the conversation might change how you see yourself? Eric noticed. He told himself he'd call later. Later became the next day, and the day after that. Meanwhile, Naomi was living a life that didn't pause for letters. Her mornings started early, Coffee brewed while the house was still quiet. Lydia moved through the kitchen with the casual confidence of a child who knew she was safe. Naomi had learned to keep her routines simple, predictable. There was comfort in knowing what came next. She packed lunches, reviewed schedules, read emails from the school. When the incident happened, a minor fall during recess, she handled it calmly. Ice pack, bandage, reassurance. Lydia had shrugged it off. It didn't even hurt that much, she said. Naomi smiled, but she noticed something. Lydia hadn't asked for her father. She never did. Children adapt faster than adults realize. They learn early where stability lives, and Lydia's stability had never been conditional. When Naomi received confirmation that the school had notified Eric, she didn't react outwardly. She had expected this moment eventually, not because she was waiting for him, but because life has a way of circling back to unfinished things. She didn't call him. She didn't warn him. She simply went on with her day. That night, after dinner, Lydia sat at the table working on homework. Naomi folded laundry nearby. "Mom," Lydia said, suddenly, not looking up from her paper. "Yes? Do you think people can change?" The question landed softly, but Naomi felt it. "Why do you ask?" she said. Lydia shrugged. "Just wondering." Naomi took a breath. "I think people can," she said carefully, "but wanting to change and actually changing aren't always the same thing." Lydia nodded, as if that made sense. She didn't ask anything else. Naomi didn't push. Silence had taught her when to let questions rest. Across town, Eric finally dialed the school the following Monday. His voice sounded steady, professional. "Yes, I received a letter about Lydia Turner," he said. "I just wanted to confirm everything's okay." The administrator reassured him, explained the incident, mentioned Naomi had already handled it. "She's very involved," the woman added casually. "Your daughter's doing well." Your daughter. The words felt unfamiliar in his mouth. After the call ended, Eric sat still. Doing well. He told himself that meant he hadn't done lasting damage, that Naomi had managed, that Lydia was fine. But a quieter thought followed. She's doing well without you. That distinction mattered more than he wanted to admit. Eric decided to reach out. Not impulsively, carefully. He drafted a message to Naomi, deleted it, tried again. Eventually, he settled on something neutral. "I heard about the incident at school. Just wanted to check in and make sure Lydia's okay." He stared at the screen before sending it, then pressed send. Naomi saw the message hours later. She didn't feel a rush of emotion. No anger, no relief, just recognition. She read it once, then she set the phone down and finished what she was doing. Later that evening, after Lydia had gone to bed, Naomi replied, "She's fine. It was minor. Nothing more." Eric read the response immediately. He felt a flicker of relief, followed by something else. Distance. Not coldness. Control. Naomi wasn't avoiding him. She simply wasn't orienting her life around his presence. They exchanged a few messages over the next few weeks. Sparse, polite. Updates about school, schedules, logistics. Eric noticed something that unsettled him. Naomi never asked him questions. Not about his life, not about his work. She responded, but she didn't invite. And that absence spoke louder than any accusation. Eric suggested meeting. "Maybe we could catch up," he wrote, "for Lydia's sake." Naomi read the message carefully. She noticed the phrasing. Not to talk, not to reconnect, for Lydia's sake. That framing mattered. She agreed, but on her terms. They met at a small cafe near the school. Neutral, public, unremarkable. Eric arrived early. He watched people come and go, feeling oddly nervous. When Naomi walked in, he stood automatically. and for a moment he didn't know what to say. She looked, well, not dramatically different, just settled, the kind of composure that isn't performed. They exchanged polite greetings and sat down. Eric tried to fill the space with small talk. Naomi listened. She always had been a good listener. Eventually, he asked about Lydia. Naomi answered, matter of fact, proud, but not boastful. She's doing well, she said. She's thoughtful, observant. Eric nodded. I wish I'd been around more, he said. The sentence hung there. Naomi didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was calm. She's had what she needed. Not what she wanted, not what she missed, what she needed. Eric felt something shift inside him. He realized then that he hadn't come here to talk about Lydia. He'd come to ease something in himself. They parted politely. No argument, no resolution. But Eric left unsettled, because for the first time he sensed that the story he told himself for years, the one where everyone eventually adjusted and moved on, was incomplete. Something had grown in his absence, something he didn't understand yet, and that realization followed him home. Late that night, unable to sleep, Eric pulled out an old box from his closet. Photos, papers, fragments of a life he once assumed he could return to. At the bottom was a folded hospital bracelet, Naomi's name on it, a date, a reminder of a moment he'd chosen not to witness. He sat on the edge of the bed, holding it, and for the first time, regret didn't feel abstract. It felt personal. But regret, he would soon learn, doesn't undo anything. It only prepares you for what comes next. And what was coming would require more than reflection. It would require reckoning. Eric began to notice the gaps. Not all at once, not dramatically. They appeared in ordinary moments. At the grocery store, when he stood in the cereal aisle longer than necessary, realizing he had no idea what Lydia liked. At the pharmacy, when he paused in front of the children's section, unsure which age range even applied anymore. In conversations with coworkers, when they mentioned school events, parent-teacher meetings, bedtime routines, things he'd opted out of so completely that they felt like another language. He told himself it wasn't too late. People always say that. It's not too late. But what they don't say is that timing changes meaning. Eric reached out more often, not constantly, just enough to feel involved. He asked Naomi how Lydia was doing in school, asked about extracurricular activities, mentioned that he'd like to attend something sometime. Naomi answered politely, briefly. She didn't discourage him, but she didn't rearrange anything either. That was the difference. Eric interpreted her calm as openness. He didn't realize calm can also mean closure. One evening, he asked if he could take Lydia out for lunch, just the two of them. Naomi didn't say no. She suggested a Saturday afternoon, a familiar diner, public, comfortable. Lydia listened quietly when Naomi told her. Okay, she said. No excitement, no resistance, just acceptance. That response unsettled Eric more than rejection would have. The diner smelled like coffee and fried food, vinyl booths, faded menus. Eric arrived early again. When Lydia walked in with Naomi, he noticed how tall she'd gotten, how she moved with an ease that suggested she knew exactly where she belonged. Naomi stayed for a moment, ordered coffee, spoke calmly. I'll be nearby, she said. Take your time. She left them alone. Eric sat across from Lydia, suddenly aware of how little he knew about her. So, he said, forcing a smile, what do you like to do? Lydia shrugged. I read. I draw. What kind of books? She thought for a moment. Stories where people figure things out. That answer stayed with him. They talked, carefully, about school, about her favorite class, about her friends. Eric laughed when she made a dry comment about homework. For a moment, it almost felt normal. Then Lydia asked something simple. "Why weren't you there when I was born?" Eric froze. Not outwardly, internally. Children don't soften their questions. They don't circle around discomfort. They go straight through it. He opened his mouth, closed it. "I was scared," he said finally. Lydia nodded. "Mom said that," she replied. The fact that Naomi hadn't spoken badly about him hit harder than criticism would have. "And now?" asked Lydia. "Now?" he repeated. "Are you still scared?" He didn't answer right away. "I don't know," he admitted. She accepted that, too. Naomi returned a short while later. The lunch ended politely. Eric thanked Lydia, told her he'd like to do it again. She nodded. Okay. That was it. No hug. No rejection. Just neutrality. On the drive home, Eric felt something settle in his chest. He hadn't failed as a father in one moment. He'd failed by absence. And absence doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Eric began to see Naomi differently, not as someone who'd simply moved on, but as someone who had built something he'd never been part of. She knew the teachers' names, the schedules, the routines. She didn't need reminders. She had systems. One afternoon, Eric asked Naomi if they could talk, really talk. She agreed. They met again, this time at a park near Lydia's school. Benches beneath tall trees, children's voices in the distance. Eric tried to explain himself. He talked about fear, about being overwhelmed, about not knowing how to handle becoming a father again so late in life. Naomi listened. When he finished, she spoke. "I understand fear," she said. "I didn't understand abandonment." The words weren't sharp. They didn't need to be. Eric nodded, guilt rising. "I want to do better," he said. "I want to be more involved." Naomi considered him carefully. "Consistency matters more than intention," she said. "Lydia doesn't need promises. She needs predictability." Eric agreed quickly. Too quickly. Over the next few months, he tried. He showed up occasionally, missed others, called some weeks, forgot others. Each time he fell short, Naomi adjusted, quietly. She never scolded him, never chased him. She simply made sure Lydia wasn't waiting. That quiet adjustment felt worse than confrontation, because there was no one to argue with. Eric began to feel like a guest in a life he'd once assumed he'd naturally belonged to. And then something happened that shifted everything. One evening, Lydia came home upset. A classmate had asked her why her last name was the same as her mom's, but she lived with only one parent. Children are observant. Naomi listened, reassured her. But later that night, after Lydia was asleep, Naomi made a decision, not out of anger, out of clarity. She reviewed documents she'd updated years earlier, legal paperwork she'd quietly put in place after the divorce. At the time, it had felt like protection. Now, it felt like preparation. Meanwhile, Eric, unaware of what Naomi was considering, received an email that would pull him into a world he didn't expect. It was an invitation to a school event, a family night. Parents encouraged to attend. Eric stared at the screen. Family night. He hesitated, then RSVP'd yes. He told himself this was a step forward. What he didn't realize was that this evening would expose the distance he'd never truly measured. And once exposed, there would be no way to explain it away. Family night filled the school gym with noise and movement. Folding chairs scraped against the floor. Children ran between tables decorated with construction paper and half-finished projects. Conversations overlapped, loud and cheerful, the kind of energy that comes from shared routines. Eric stood just inside the entrance for a moment, scanning the room. He recognized almost no one. That alone unsettled him. Parents greeted teachers by first name. Volunteers moved confidently from table to table, checking lists, handing out supplies, calming small disagreements. This wasn't a place you wandered into occasionally. It was a place you belonged to through repetition. Eric spotted Lydia near the art display, standing beside Naomi. She was explaining something animatedly, her hands moving as she spoke. Naomi listened, smiling, nodding at the right moments. Eric watched before approaching. He noticed how naturally Naomi interacted with others. Teachers leaned in when she spoke. Other parents greeted her warmly, asking questions, making comments about schedules and upcoming events. No one treated her like someone managing alone. They treated her like someone central. When Eric finally stepped closer, Lydia noticed him. She waved once, small, reserved. Naomi turned. "Hi," she said. Her tone was neutral, not distant, not inviting. Eric joined them, suddenly aware of how little he understood about this environment. A teacher approached Naomi. "Naomi, we finalized the committee list," she said. "We'll send the notes tomorrow." Naomi nodded. "That works. Thank you." The teacher glanced at Eric briefly, polite but uninterested, then moved on. Eric felt invisible. As the evening continued, Eric tried to participate. He followed Lydia from table to table, complimented her work, asked questions. She answered politely, but when she needed something, paper, help, permission, she went to Naomi. Not out of habit, out of trust. Eric overheard another parent mention Naomi's reliability. "She always knows what's going on," the woman said. "I don't know how she does it." Naomi smiled. "You do what needs to be done." Eric stood there, the words settling uncomfortably. Later, as families gathered for a short presentation, Eric found himself seated beside Naomi. A speaker thanked volunteers, mentioned Naomi by name. Applause followed. Eric clapped too, but his hands felt heavy. He realized something then. Naomi wasn't surviving. She was leading, and he had no idea how long that had been true. After the event, as people filtered out, Eric walked with Naomi and Lydia towards the parking lot. The air was cool. Quiet settled in once the doors closed behind them. "I didn't realize how involved you were," Eric said. Naomi didn't respond immediately. "I didn't need you to," she said finally. The honesty of it stopped him. They reached their cars. Lydia hugged Naomi without thinking. Then, after a brief pause, she hugged Eric too. Quick, polite. "Good night," she said. Eric watched them drive away. Alone in the lot, he sat in his car longer than necessary. He thought about all the moments he'd missed, all the small adjustments Naomi had made without ever asking for help. He told himself he needed to step up, do more, be present. But wanting to step into a life already structured around someone else required humility he wasn't sure he possessed. The next few weeks tested that. Eric tried to attend more events, offered to help. Sometimes Naomi accepted, sometimes she didn't need to, and each time she declined politely, it reminded him that he wasn't essential. That realization followed him into other parts of his life. At work, he noticed how often he relied on others to stabilize things he avoided. In relationships, how quickly he withdrew when expectations rose. A pattern began to emerge. One evening, Eric asked Naomi if they could talk privately. She agreed. They met at her house, the same house she'd lived in for years. Eric hadn't been inside since Lydia was an infant. The place felt different now, intentional, calm, not preserved for memory, but arranged for living. They sat at the kitchen table. Eric spoke first. "I feel like I don't know where I fit," he said. Naomi listened. "I want to be part of Lydia's life, but it feels like everything's already handled." Naomi folded her hands. That didn't happen by accident. It happened because I couldn't afford uncertainty. Eric nodded slowly. I didn't mean to disappear. But you did, she replied. No anger, just fact. Eric leaned back, exhaling. So what happens now? He asked. Naomi met his eyes. Now we are honest about what is and what isn't. The words felt heavier than he expected, because honesty would mean facing something he'd avoided for years, that his role in Lydia's life wasn't waiting for him to claim. It had been shaped by absence, and reshaping it would require more than good intentions. It would require consistency he'd never practiced. Eric left that night thoughtful, quiet, but the full weight of what Naomi had built and what he'd forfeited still hadn't fully settled. That realization was coming. Soon. Eric didn't sleep well after that conversation. Not because Naomi had said anything cruel, not because there had been an argument, but because she hadn't needed to raise her voice. There was something unsettling about being spoken to calmly when you already know you're on unstable ground. The next morning, he replayed her words while brushing his teeth, while driving to work, while sitting through meetings he barely heard. I couldn't afford uncertainty. That sentence stayed with him. He realized then that while he had been protecting himself from discomfort years ago, Naomi had been protecting a child. Those two motivations don't age the same way. At work, Eric found himself distracted. He stared at spreadsheets without absorbing the numbers. When colleagues talked about their kids' schedules, he listened differently now. Not with detachment, with awareness. That evening, he called Naomi, not to discuss Lydia, not to make plans. I need to understand something, he said when she answered. She listened. Did you ever expect me to come back? He asked. There was a pause on the line. No, Naomi said honestly. I prepared for you not to. The clarity in her voice surprised him. You didn't leave room for me, he said before thinking. Naomi didn't respond immediately. I left room for stability, she replied. They're not the same thing. That ended the conversation. Eric sat in his apartment, phone still in his hand, feeling something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Displacement. Not rejection, replacement by structure, by routine, by responsibility. He thought about Lydia again, about her neutral tone, her careful distance. Children, he realized, don't resent absence the way adults do. They adapt. And adaptation can look like independence. Weeks passed. Eric tried harder, stayed longer at school events, followed through more consistently. Naomi acknowledged it, but didn't praise it. She didn't need to, because Lydia noticed too. One afternoon, Lydia told Naomi that Eric had helped her with a project. He stayed the whole time, she said. Naomi smiled. That's good. Lydia paused. I think he's trying. Naomi nodded. I think so too. She didn't add more, because effort doesn't erase history, it only creates a possibility for something new. Eric, meanwhile, started to sense something else shifting. Naomi wasn't just managing life, she was directing it. He overheard conversations, saw emails copied to her name, noticed how others deferred to her judgment. One evening, while waiting in the car during Lydia's activity, Eric overheard two parents talking nearby. She's the one who keeps everything running, one said. I don't know how she does it alone, the other replied. Eric sat quietly, listening. Alone. The word stung. Not because it wasn't true, but because he realized how long he'd let it be true. That night, Eric made a decision. He asked Naomi if they could have a serious conversation. Not about schedules, not about logistics, about the future. She agreed. They met again at her house. This time, Eric noticed things he hadn't before. The organization, the absence of clutter, the sense that everything had a place and a reason. Naomi offered tea, sat across from him. Eric cleared his throat. I've been thinking about what you said, about stability, about preparation. She listened. I don't want to just show up occasionally, he said. I want to be dependable. Naomi considered him. That's a commitment, not a statement. He nodded. I know. There was a pause. I also need to know something about how you see me. Naomi leaned back slightly. I see you as Lydia's father and as someone who left. Both truths. Neither softened. Eric swallowed. Is there room for more than that? He asked. Naomi didn't answer immediately. There's room for consistency, she said. Time will decide the rest. That wasn't the answer he wanted, but it was the only one she could offer honestly. Eric left feeling unsettled but strangely clear. For the first time, he understood that this wasn't about earning forgiveness. It was about rebuilding trust. And trust, once broken through absence, isn't repaired with apologies. It's rebuilt through presence. Weeks later, an unexpected situation accelerated everything. Lydia became ill at school. Not seriously, but enough to require immediate pickup. Naomi was in a meeting she couldn't leave. The school called Eric. For a moment, he froze. Then he said yes. He arrived quickly, handled the paperwork, sat with Lydia until Naomi arrived. When Naomi walked in and saw them together, Lydia resting calmly, Eric focused and attentive, she felt something shift. Not relief, recognition. That evening, after Lydia was settled, Naomi spoke. You did well today, he said. I was supposed to. She studied him. I want to be clear about something. Doing what's necessary now doesn't undo the years you weren't here. I know, he replied. But it matters, she continued, because Lydia sees patterns. She always has. Eric understood. This wasn't about him anymore. It never had been. And for the first time since the divorce, he stopped centering his own feelings in the story. But fate wasn't finished yet, because the next chapter would force a decision neither of them could postpone. And once that decision was made, there would be no quiet way back. The decision didn't announce itself loudly. It arrived the way most life-altering moments do, through necessity, not drama. Naomi had been careful for years, not fearful, careful. There was a difference. She had learned early that when you are the only constant in a child's life, you don't get to improvise. You prepare. So when the letter from the legal office arrived, one she had been expecting for some time, she wasn't surprised. She read it once, then again. Then she sat quietly at the kitchen table long after the coffee had gone cold. The matter itself wasn't urgent, but the implication was. Lydia was growing older. Questions were becoming sharper. The future was no longer theoretical. Naomi had always told herself she would act before circumstances forced her hand. Now, they were knocking. That evening, Naomi asked Eric if he could stop by. Not to talk about school, not about schedules, just to talk. Eric arrived on time. He'd been doing that more often lately. He noticed the stillness of the house, not empty, settled. Naomi didn't offer tea this time. She gestured toward the table. I need to talk to you about something important, she said. Eric nodded. He had learned to listen now. She slid a folder across the table. He didn't open it right away. What is this? He asked. Planning, she said, for Lydia. The word landed differently than he expected. He opened the folder slowly. Inside were documents. Clean, organized, thought through. Guardianship preferences, educational planning, contingencies. He looked up. You did all this without telling me? He asked. Yes, Naomi replied, because for a long time I couldn't assume you'd be available. The truth wasn't cruel. It was earned. Eric swallowed. "I've been trying," he said. "I see that," she replied. "This isn't about punishment. It's about protection." He nodded, though something tightened in his chest. "You didn't include me," he said quietly. "I didn't exclude you," Naomi said. "I planned around what existed at the time." Silence followed. Eric realized then that the most painful part wasn't being left out. It was realizing how reasonable it had been. "I want to be part of these decisions now," he said. Naomi considered him. "That's possible," she said, "but it has to be earned over time, not assumed." That word again. Time. Eric left that night unsettled, but determined. He wanted to prove something, not just to Naomi, to himself. The following months tested that resolve. There were moments he showed up when it was inconvenient, moments he chose Lydia over comfort. But there were also moments he hesitated, moments old habits whispered that effort should come with recognition. Naomi noticed everything. She said very little. That silence, measured, observant, did something Eric hadn't anticipated. It forced him to sit with himself. Then came the call. Late afternoon, unexpected. Naomi's voice was steady but urgent. "I need you," she said. "Now." Lydia had been involved in an accident. Minor, but frightening. Nothing life-threatening, enough to shake routine. Eric arrived at the hospital breathless, heart-pounding. He saw Naomi first. Calm, focused, holding Lydia's hand. Lydia looked scared, but composed. When she saw Eric, her eyes widened slightly. He sat beside her without hesitation. He didn't ask what to do. He stayed. Hours passed. Doctors spoke. Tests were run. Everything was fine, but something else happened in that room. Eric didn't leave. Not when it got uncomfortable, not when it dragged on. He stayed through boredom, fear, waiting. Naomi watched him quietly. Not with hope, with evaluation. That night, after Lydia slept, Naomi and Eric stood in the hallway. "You didn't leave," Naomi said. "I wasn't going to," Eric replied. She studied him. "That's new," she said. It wasn't praise. It was acknowledgement. Days later, Lydia said something that surprised them both. "Dad stayed," she told Naomi, matter-of-factly. Just that. No emotion attached. But Naomi knew what it meant. Patterns were forming. Eric began to understand something uncomfortable. Being present didn't feel heroic. It felt ordinary. And ordinary consistency was harder than dramatic gestures. Weeks later, Naomi revisited the folder. She made small changes, not because Eric demanded them, but because his behavior warranted reconsideration. But fate doesn't move on our timelines. It introduces complications. The next one came through work. Eric's company announced layoffs. His position wasn't guaranteed. Fear crept back in, familiar, persuasive. Old instincts whispered the same things they always had. Pull back, protect yourself, simplify. For the first time, Eric noticed the pattern before it consumed him. He told Naomi, "I might lose my job," he said one evening. She nodded. "Okay," she replied. Just that. No panic, no reassurance. Her calm unsettled him. "You're not worried?" he asked. "I'm aware," she said. "There's a difference." Eric realized then that Naomi's strength wasn't reactionary. It was structural. She had built a life that didn't collapse under uncertainty, and that was something he'd never done. The layoffs happened. Eric lost his job. For a brief moment, the old fear surged. Then reality intervened. Lydia needed routine. Naomi needed reliability. Eric had a choice: disappear into self-pity or stay. He stayed. He took temporary work, adjusted schedules, showed up anyway. Naomi watched. So did Lydia. And slowly, quietly, something shifted. But the final test hadn't arrived yet, because fate, when it truly speaks, doesn't whisper through inconvenience. It speaks through consequence. And that moment was approaching. One that would force Eric to confront not just who he had been, but who he could never be again. The consequence arrived quietly, disguised as an opportunity. Naomi received the call on a Tuesday morning while Lydia was at school. It was from an attorney she'd worked with years earlier, the same one who had helped her put safeguards in place when life still felt unstable. The voice on the other end was calm, professional. "There's a matter we should discuss," he said. "Nothing urgent, but important." Naomi thanked him and scheduled a meeting. She didn't tell Eric right away, not because she was hiding anything, but because she needed clarity before conversation. That afternoon, she walked into the attorney's office with the same composure she carried everywhere else. She listened carefully as he explained a situation involving a long-term educational trust Naomi had quietly established for Lydia years earlier. At the time, it had been a precaution. Now it had matured into something significant. Options were presented, adjustments could be made, decisions were required. Naomi asked thoughtful questions, took notes, requested time. When she left the office, she didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt resolved. That evening, after dinner, Naomi told Eric they needed to talk. He arrived sensing the weight of the request. They sat at the kitchen table again, the place where clarity always seemed to surface. "I need to make a decision about Lydia's future," Naomi said. "One that will shape her options long term." Eric nodded. "I want to be included," he said carefully. Naomi met his eyes. "You are included," she said, "but inclusion doesn't mean influence." The distinction landed sharply. She explained the trust, the planning, the years of preparation. Eric listened, a knot forming in his chest. "You did all this alone," he said. "Yes," Naomi replied, "because at the time I had to." Eric leaned forward. "I want to contribute," he said, "financially, however I can." Naomi paused. "That's not what this is about," she said. "This is about stability that doesn't disappear when circumstances change." He understood what she was saying. His past instability had been factored into the future, quietly, reasonably, and now that future existed without depending on him. Eric felt something shift. Not anger, loss. "I'm realizing something," he said slowly. "I thought coming back would restore what I left." Naomi listened. "But it doesn't work that way," he continued. "It just shows me how much moved forward without me." She nodded. "That's what time does. It keeps going." Eric sat back, absorbing it. That night, Lydia asked something unexpected. "Is everything okay?" she asked Naomi. "Yes," Naomi said honestly. Lydia looked between them. "You both look serious." Eric smiled gently. "We're just talking about the future." Lydia considered that. "I like my future." Naomi smiled. Later, after Lydia was asleep, Eric stood by the door. "I'm proud of you," he said to Naomi. She nodded. "I know." Not dismissive. Certain. Eric walked out into the night feeling something close behind him. Finality. Not because Naomi had shut a door, but because she no longer needed to keep one open. Over the following weeks, Eric noticed the shift. Naomi's decisions didn't revolve around him anymore. They never had, but now she saw it clearly. Lydia's life was moving forward on a path Naomi had secured with foresight, not hope. Eric was part of it, but no longer central, and for the first time, he understood the difference between presence and position. Then came the moment that sealed it. Eric received paperwork related to the trust, not for approval, but for acknowledgement. His signature wasn't required, his consent wasn't needed. He was informed. That detail carried more weight than any argument ever could. He sat with the documents for a long time. This wasn't punishment. This was structure. And structure, once built, doesn't rearrange itself to soothe regret. Eric realized then that fate wasn't cruel. It was precise. It didn't shout. It simply aligned outcomes with patterns. And his pattern had been absence. That evening, Eric went for a long walk. He thought about the man he had been when Naomi was pregnant, fearful, overwhelmed, convinced that leaving was the lesser damage. He thought about the man he was now, older, more aware, standing in a life shaped by choices he could no longer revise. Late regret is a quiet thing. It doesn't scream. It sits with you. And as Eric walked, he finally understood the lesson he'd been avoiding. You don't get to decide the value of what you abandon. Time does. And time had spoken. Eric didn't respond to the paperwork right away. Not because he was angry, not because he was confused, but because something in him finally understood what the documents represented. Finality without hostility. They didn't accuse him. They didn't shame him. They simply reflected a reality that had been forming for years. He had returned, but too late to shape the foundation. That night, Eric sat alone in his apartment, the paperwork spread out on the table. He noticed how quiet the space felt. Not peaceful, just empty. He thought about Naomi's house, how it felt grounded, intentional, lived in. He remembered the kitchen table conversations, the calm in her voice, the way decisions were made without emotional bargaining. That wasn't coldness, that was preparation. The following weekend, Eric spent time with Lydia again. They went to a small park, walked slowly, sat on a bench eating snacks from a paper bag. Lydia talked about school, about a project she was excited about a teacher she admired. Eric listened, really listened. Then Lydia said something that caught him off guard. "Mom says you weren't ready before." He stayed quiet. "She says that doesn't make you bad," Lydia added. "Just not ready." Eric nodded. "That's fair," he said. Lydia looked at him thoughtfully. "I think you're trying now." He smiled softly. "I am." She accepted that. Children don't demand perfection. They respond to patterns. But patterns don't erase history. They simply build forward. Eric realized something important in that moment. He would never be the center of Lydia's life. And that was okay. What wasn't okay was pretending that showing up late deserved the same weight as staying through the hardest years. That understanding didn't come with bitterness. It came with humility. Later that evening, Eric stopped by Naomi's house to drop Lydia off. Naomi thanked him. Routine. Calm. Before leaving, Eric hesitated. "I want you to know," he said, "I see what you did, what you built." Naomi nodded. "It wasn't for recognition," she said. "I know. That's why it matters." He paused. "I don't expect things to change," he added. "I just wanted to say it." Naomi studied him for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "That's enough." Enough. Eric drove home understanding that some words are meant to close chapters, not reopen them. Weeks turned into months. Life settled. Eric remained present in Lydia's life, consistent, measured, reliable. Naomi adjusted accordingly, but cautiously. Trust grew slowly, not because she hoped for more, because Lydia deserved steadiness. And Eric finally understood something that had taken him years to grasp. Love that arrives late doesn't undo what absence created. It adapts, or it fades. There were moments, late at night, when Eric replayed his past choices, not to torture himself, but to understand them. He realized how often fear had disguised itself as logic, how many times he told himself he was being practical when he was really avoiding responsibility. Those realizations didn't fix the past, but they reshaped how he moved forward. One afternoon, Lydia came home with a school assignment, a reflection project. She was supposed to write about someone who influenced her life. She sat at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, thinking. Naomi watched quietly. After a while, Lydia looked up. "Can I write about you?" she asked. Naomi smiled. "Of course." Later, Lydia added another name. Eric noticed. He didn't need to, because influence isn't claimed, it's earned. And fate, when it finally speaks, doesn't always take things away. Sometimes it simply rearranges their importance. Eric realized something important in that moment. He would never be the center of Lydia's life, and that was okay. What wasn't okay was pretending that showing up late deserved the same weight as staying through the hardest years. That understanding didn't come with bitterness. It came with humility. As the seasons changed, Eric felt something settle inside him. Not peace, acceptance. He couldn't reclaim what he'd walked away from, but he could honor it by not repeating the same mistake again. And Naomi? She continued as she always had, quietly, deliberately, with patience that had never been passive. She didn't celebrate Eric's regret. She didn't resent it either, because her life had already moved beyond needing validation. She had done the hardest work when no one was watching, and now that work spoke for itself. Fate had spoken, not loudly, not cruelly, just clearly. And when it did, there was no argument left to make. Only understanding. Years later, when Eric thought back on the moment Naomi slid that folder across the table, he understood something he hadn't been able to see at the time. That moment wasn't about paperwork. It was about position. Not the position he once assumed he held by default, but the one Naomi had quietly earned through endurance. Life slowed down as Eric got older, not in a dramatic way, just enough to make reflection unavoidable. The noise faded, the distractions thinned out, and in that quiet, memory became louder. He remembered Naomi during her pregnancy, how tired she had been, how little she asked for, how much she carried without complaint. He remembered convincing himself that leaving was a form of honesty, that staying would have been worse. At the time, that logic had comforted him. Now it felt hollow. Because honesty without responsibility is just escape with better language. Eric didn't speak about his regret often, not because it wasn't there, but because he understood something important. Regret isn't meant to be performed. It's meant to change you. He showed up for Lydia consistently, not loudly, not dramatically. He attended graduations, recitals, quiet dinners. He learned when to speak and when to stay silent. He learned that being present didn't mean being central. And that lesson humbled him in ways nothing else ever had. Lydia grew into a grounded young woman. She carried her mother's steadiness, her clarity, her calm confidence. When people asked about her parents, she didn't explain. She didn't need to. Her life spoke for itself. Naomi watched her daughter step fully into her own life and felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not relief. Completion. She never told her story publicly, never framed herself as a survivor or a victim. She didn't need language to validate what time had already proven. Her strength had never been loud. It had been reliable. And reliability, unlike regret, compounds. Eric understood that too late, but not too late to stop repeating the pattern. On quiet evenings, he sometimes sat alone and thought about how differently things might have unfolded if he'd stayed when fear first appeared. But then another thought followed. Staying doesn't mean staying physically. It means staying emotionally. It means staying when the future looks inconvenient. That was the courage he'd lacked. And courage, once missed, doesn't return on command. It returns only as a lesson. Naomi never asked Eric to carry her story. She carried it herself. And in doing so, she ensured that Lydia would never confuse love with abandonment or patience with weakness. The truth Eric finally accepted was simple and painful and permanent. You don't lose people when you leave. You lose the version of yourself that could have grown alongside them. Fate didn't punish him. It reflected him. It showed him what happens when someone walks away during the hardest season, believing there will always be time to return. There usually isn't. And if you're listening to this story wondering what it means for you, here is the lesson Naomi lived without ever announcing it. Silence doesn't mean nothing is happening. Patience isn't waiting, it's preparing. And when someone leaves you during your most vulnerable season, their absence does not define your future. What you build afterward does. Because by the time fate speaks, you've already become someone who no longer needs to hear an apology.